Okay, well, thank you everybody for again coming out. I hope you hear something of interest to you. I'm always happy to follow up with students via sort of one-on-one Zoom or by phone or by email about any clarifications or any aspect of the presentation that you're going to see today. A little bit about myself. My name is Shane Huff. As Dr. Hancock's mentioned, I'm the diplomat in residence for the Central South region. There are 18 diplomats in residence for the U.S. Department of State. We serve as regional recruiters, both at universities and also for professional organizations and folks that have been out in the workforce. This time of year is really sort of the beginning of our internship and student programs application window time of the year. So things are going to start opening as they have already begun to today. I'll talk about that in just a bit. I am a Foreign Service officer. I have been with the U.S. Department of State for roughly 22 years now. We've lived, my family and we've raised 3 kids overseas in, I think, at least 6, if not, let me stick with 6 different countries, primarily in Latin America. Typically, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, we serve in a particular country for 3 years at a time. So that would roughly be 7. And also, there are a lot of options for going back to Washington, which most people tend to do. So with that opener, let's jump right into the presentation. Dr. Hancock's next slide, if you would. So the mission of the U.S. Department of State, it's important to understand what we do before you can be convinced that doing an internship with us or having a career with us is something that would be interesting to you. To protect and promote U.S. security, prosperity, and democratic values, and shape an international environment in which all Americans can thrive. That is the official statement on our website. Really, to put it in plain language, our job overseas is to make the rest of the world friendly for Americans, whether that is American tourists or whether that's American businesses, American exporters, all sorts of fora we tend to be involved in overseas has to do with making the world a safe, and not only safe, but a friendly place, and a place in which Americans can prosper. So part of that is sort of, if I were doing this physically, I'd ask for a show of hands about who's been overseas, who has a passport, who has traveled before. I assume that there's a fair number of folks that have been overseas. And if you have, and if you've gotten a passport, you've already engaged with the U.S. Department of State. If you've ever lost a passport overseas, you certainly have seen us overseas. If you have adopted a child, and I assume most people here have not, but lots of Americans have adopted children from overseas, then you spoke with the U.S. Department of State official. If you exported, a business good overseas, you've probably spoken to a Department of State official. So there's a wide range of things that we do. We just do them overseas primarily, while lots of other agencies do them domestically. We have the responsibility for doing it internationally. Next slide, Dr. Hancock. A little bit about sort of some statistics about the Department of State. The Department of State is pretty large. It's probably a medium-sized to large-sized corporation-sized organization. We have 276 posts abroad. That's just a facility, either an embassy or a consulate abroad in 191 countries. At this point, you can probably guess the countries we don't have a presence in, Iran being one of those countries. There's just a very small handful of countries we are not present in some way. We are clearly headquartered in Washington, D.C., as our most federal agencies. We have 13,000 roughly foreign service officers. We call them FSOs. Those are folks that are primarily stationed abroad in our embassies and consulates. But we also have 11,000 civil service employees. Those are folks primarily based in Washington, but we also have a ton of folks like the Passport Agency in Hot Springs, Arkansas, or the Passport Agency here in New Orleans, or the Diplomatic Security Outpost in some of the major cities in the United States. And somewhat surprising to most people, we hire more foreigners to work for the Department of State than we do Americans. We have roughly 45,000 locally employed staff. And those folks are almost exclusively overseas, working for us in embassies and consulates, sort of being eyes and ears, helping us understand the culture where we may not, know some of the local things. So we have just a ton of folks that work overseas with us. Our agency is roughly 230, I think, 2 or 3 years old now. Thomas Jefferson, everybody knows Thomas Jefferson was our first Secretary of State. The organization was somewhat smaller when he was the Secretary of State. He only had 6 staff and 2 diplomatic posts. And if you think hard, you can probably come to the guess that those were in London and in Paris. Thomas Jefferson had a tough life. So next slide, Dr. Hancock. Let me give you just an idea of where, how we look at the world. We look at the world in 2 different ways: geographically and functionally. So this is an example of how we would separate the world geographically. By bureau, we call these our political bureaus, and those from left to right: Western Hemisphere affairs, European and Eurasian affairs. Everybody wants to go there. Near Eastern affairs, African affairs, South and Central Asian affairs, and East Asian and Pacific affairs. So those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 geographical bureaus are very powerful within the Department of State, and tend to dictate a lot of our foreign policy in these very specific regions. Next, Dr. Hancock. We also deal with the world in a functional way. So aside from our geographical bureaus, we have a ton of functional bureaus, and I don't expect anybody to try to read all of this or memorize it, or even absorb any part of it. What I'd like you to be is impressed with the different types of portfolios that we cover. We have undersecretaries. You'll see the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. Those are our geographic bureaus. But then we have the Undersecretary for Economic and Environment and Energy, for Arms Control, International Security, management, civilian security, democracy and human rights, and public diplomacy and public affairs. So if there is something that you're interested in, we probably have an office that deals with that policy issue overseas, whether that's arms control or refugee assistance, humanitarian assistance, just you name it. There is someone in the Department of State dealing with it. And that becomes important when we talk about internships and opportunities for students at the Department of State. If you have an interest in any sort of international affair type policy, there is probably a place that you can do that type of substantive work as an intern with the U.S. Department of State. Next slide, Dr. Hancock. So let me tell you just a little bit about the different types of careers that we have before we get into internships and fellowships. Foreign service, we have 3 different types of employee. We have the civil service employee that we talked about earlier, that is primarily in Washington or in some of our domestic offices around the country. Then we have 2 types of foreign service officer. We have the generalist officer. I am a generalist. I'm a generalist economic officer, which you'll see there on the list of 5 career tracks. Then we have foreign service specialists, which we can talk about if anyone's interested. Those are people that have very specific skills, like they're a nurse practitioner, or they're a psychiatrist, or they or an information technology or cybersecurity specialist, or an engineer, things like that. Very specialized types of officers. What I'm going to talk about now and describe a bit is our 5 career tracks for our generalist foreign service officer. You'll see the 5 there. Let's start from the top. Consular officers. These are folks that are in our embassies overseas, interviewing host country nationals who would like to travel to the United States on a visa, for instance, or who have married an American citizen and would like to begin the immigration process. They do adoptions. They also do a whole range of assistance with Americans traveling overseas. For instance, as I mentioned before, if you've lost your passport, if you find that you've run out of money while overseas and can't get back home, any sort of thing like that is going to be dealt with through our American Citizen Services officer. If you find yourself in jail overseas, and I recommend don't find yourself in jail overseas, the first person you'll likely to see is a consular officer. Almost all foreign service officers, when they begin that first tour, we all serve as consular officers because it is so important, at least for the first tour. So that's roughly 2 years. As my first consular tour, I was on prison, sort of the prison visit portfolio. So I would go out in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and visit folks who had been arrested for carrying, cocaine through the airport, for instance, or trying to smuggle things through the airport into the United States, or a whole host of other reasons that people were sort of imprisoned overseas. Now we don't seek to get people out of prison. We provide them with the resources that they need, like local lawyers, and to make sure that their parents or their family know where they are and how they are. And we do welfare and whereabouts checks just to make sure that they're being properly treated. So that's our consular officers. We have a whole cadre of folks that do only those things. I'm an economic officer, moving to the second on the list there. As you might expect, we do a lot of trade facilitation. Anytime that an American business has a problem overseas, we will work with the foreign government to help sort that problem out. But we also do a whole sort of series of other things, from technology and science diplomacy to energy diplomacy and environmental issues. We also do things like COVID-19 surveillance and helping our partner nations be able to sort of measure and report COVID numbers. That's an example of the most recent sort of pandemic and health related issue that we've dealt with. So economic officer is sort of a jack of all trades in addition to being a trade officer. Management officers, and this is something we're really in need of now, are folks who maybe went to business school or are very good with managing groups of people, organizational units. They do everything for us to make the embassy work overseas. So they are in charge of a whole host of things, from procurement to human resources to making sure bills get paid and the electricity stays on, and also engaging the local government when we're building a new building or doing other things like that. Our political officers, fourth in this list, they do a lot of things related to engaging the host country presidency, the host country Congress, on things like trafficking in persons, refugee affairs, political military liaison work. Those kind of things would fall into the sort of what the political officer does. They also do promotion of democracy, watching elections overseas. So if there's a presidential election happening in Honduras, the political office will sort of spearhead our monitoring effort. So what that really means on the ground is they will gather a big group of volunteers from the embassy and then figure out where people are going to go, so that we can basically just set up shop outside of voting centers and polling booths and things like that to watch what's happening and make sure that we don't see any signs of fraud or things like that, and then report back to the embassy. And lastly, public diplomacy officers. This is our sort of the mouth of the embassy. Anything that is said generally either comes from the ambassador or comes from our public affairs officer, who is our chief public diplomacy officer at the embassy. So they do all manner of engagement with the press, whether that is TV, radio, or newspaper. They do a whole slew of other things as well within our cultural affairs portfolio. So they'll do things like find a gospel choir from Jackson, Mississippi, and bring them to Paraguay, and arrange a series of concerts all around the country, so that folks in Paraguay who may never get to the United States or witness this kind of performance on their own would be exposed to that, and be, in the end, the real sort of point of those efforts are to build soft power within, the other countries where we have connections to our embassy. So that is a very powerful force, and it really connects. The cultural connections are what is often some of the strongest diplomatic connections that we have with other countries. So with that, I can certainly take questions on any of these when we get to the Q&A. But with that, Dr. Hancock, would you move to the next slide, please? So our next slide is about the specialist cone, and I think I've gone through some of these. I would highlight one thing: our law enforcement and security cone is a specialty, but doesn't require any sort of special major. So if anybody's interested in law enforcement, we have sort of an FBI equivalent called our diplomatic security special agent position. And those are really interesting positions. They do a whole manner of investigations overseas and make sure that we're all safe while we live there. So if anybody's interested in that, happy to talk more. Next slide, Dr. Hancock. Diversity is something that we talk about a lot, and you all have heard it. It has been in the news for many years, I feel like at this point. The Department of State takes diversity very seriously, and diversity in all its forms. Not only racial, ethnic diversity, not only gender and identity diversity, but also geographic diversity, which is what makes my job fun here. I could probably only name maybe 10 officers, Foreign Service officers from the state of Arkansas, probably fewer than that went to the University of Arkansas. So, if you're from Arkansas and from, the Central South, you already represent a type of diversity to the Department of State, and that's geographic diversity. So we're looking for all types of diversity for all underrepresented groups across the United States. Right now, I would say things are getting a whole lot better since General Powell, Secretary Powell, began a lot of our diversity recruitment efforts way back in the day, roughly 20 years ago. The State Department is a different place than it used to be. We have a wide range of all sorts of people, from first-generation college students to first-generation immigrants working for the Department of State. So I think the message behind this slide is basically, if you have any interest at all in the U.S. Department of State, please don't talk yourself out of applying for any of these opportunities we're going to talk about, because there's a place for almost everybody in today's Department of State. Now, Dr. Hancock, next slide, please. So let me jump right into some of the internship. We have basically 2 internship programs. We have a number of other student programs, but our internship programs open at this time of year and sort of extend into October. This one, the U.S. Foreign Service Internship Program, is for sophomores and juniors at the time of application. So right now, if you're a sophomore or junior, you are eligible to apply for this. This internship opened today, as a matter of fact, and will stay open until September 8th. And I'll give you the link in a later slide to apply for this if you're interested. This is a 2-summer internship program. It is primarily focused on students that have some type of financial need. In some way, they couldn't do an internship in Washington, D.C. on their own funds, whether that is they're a Pell Grant recipient and have Pell Grant status, or whether their parents saved up a whole lot of money while they were young and are helping them pay for school. The key thing here is that you need to demonstrate that you couldn't do this type of internship on your own, either through your FAFSA report or by making a statement of financial need. And when you go through the application process, you will find a place where you can make that statement. You can explain your situation. It's not as hard to make the case for financial need as you might think. This is a 2-summer internship program. As I mentioned, the first summer is in our Washington, D.C. headquarters. And you'll remember back to that big organogram with all of those functional offices there. You can choose to apply for any of those offices that are offering an internship, and most of them do. So it's a good chance to do really substantive work in a portfolio that you're really interested in or are studying in school. The second summer, so that would not be the first summer, we're talking about next summer, 2025. The second summer would be summer 2026. You would spend at a U.S. embassy or consulate, and you have a lot of say in where you go. Not all embassies or consulates offer internships, but of those that do, you get a strong voice in where you go. So that's a question that comes up often. How much say do I have in where I go and what I do? A fair amount. The important part about this, all expenses are paid, all travel expenses for both of these summers. There's a salary associated with this at the GS4 level, which doesn't mean a lot to most people. That's roughly $20 an hour in salary. We provide corporate housing for all our interns and even a transportation and food stipend. So for folks who certainly couldn't do this on their own, there is no reason not to apply for this internship. Most folks coming out have made money rather than spent money doing an internship in Washington and then overseas. There is a catch here. You must have a 3.2 or better GPA, and you must be able to receive a secret or higher security clearance. All of our interns in all of these programs will undergo a security clearance process, just like I did when I started with the State Department, and undergo every 5 years. And it's not a daunting process, and most people pass the process without any problem. It just takes some time, and so we back up the application window so that we allow about 9 months of advance sort of notice prior to you wanting to start the internship. So, we're opening the window for applications now through September 8th for this to start in summer of 2025. And most of that time will be spent waiting for your security clearance. At least probably 4 months is the average nowadays. Dr. Hancock, next slide. The next internship program is a 1-semester internship program. This, in contrast to the USF SIP, this one really requires no financial need or demonstration thereof at all. The same 3.2 GPA applies. This is, again, a 1-semester, not summer necessarily, but 1-semester internship. We take in interns in the spring, in the summer, and also in the fall. We are coming up on the summer 2025 window for applications that will open on October 1st. So stay tuned for that. Again, this is a 1-semester. Everything else that applied to the previous internship also applies to this as far as benefits. Everything is paid. In addition to sophomores and juniors, graduate students who will not be graduating directly after the internship can also apply. So this is not just for undergrads, but also graduate students. Dr. Hancock's next slide, please. Just a quick mention of our internship application windows. The first one, the SIP that I just talked about, is October 1st through the 15th. And the U.S. Foreign Service Internship Program, that's the 2-summer program, will open, actually it opened earlier today, August 28th. It will stay open until September the 8th. Both of these internships, you can access an application and apply through usajobs.gov. That is the portal for almost all jobs in the federal government, including these 2 internship programs. A weird characteristic of our internship programs in particular is that we hire interns as federal employees. Interns will get time sort of served towards retirement, all the benefits that come with being a federal employee. So we will hire them as a federal employee, and then 3 months later, we will separate them, just like any other federal employee. That process would be the same. So our application process is held through the same portal, usajobs.gov. And for USF SIP, you can see the link there. But for the SIP, that has yet to open, should be October the 1st. And when that opens, we will get a link to USA Jobs that I can certainly pass around and get out to everybody. Dr. Hancock's next slide, please. Let me talk quickly about some of our study abroad programs. And all of our study abroad programs, with few exceptions, are centered on language learning, because speaking a foreign language, though not required to become a Foreign Service officer at the beginning, is something that is required of all Foreign Service officers as they go through their career. And you will likely be assigned a language during your first post to learn. So language study and the ability to get out and learn a language in an immersive environment overseas is something that we take very seriously and provide some opportunities for. Next slide, Dr. Hancock, and we'll talk about some of those opportunities. First being the Critical Language Scholarship Program, CLS. We certainly value those folks who are coming into the Foreign Service who speak world languages. My language, primary language is Spanish. We have lots of Spanish speakers. We have lots of French and Italian speakers. What we don't have a lot of are Mandarin speakers or Arabic speakers or Swahili speakers. There's a list of what we call critical languages, and that is why the Critical Language Scholarship Program was established. It is a summer study abroad program. It is for students in any field. We don't care what you're studying. All we want to know is that you would like to study a critical language. It is fully funded by the U.S. government and the State Department in specific. Everything is paid for, except we don't pay for your passport application. I'm not clear why that's the case since we issued them, but that is something we continue to talk about. The website is www.clscholarship.org. Again, that's a State Department scholarship, but it is administered by a third party, and so they have a website that is separate from a state.gov domain. Dr. Hancock, let's go to the next slide, and I'll talk about what's considered a critical language. We have 14 of them, and there are two parts of this slide. Don't be confused. I'll go through them starting on the left. These are summer programs where you are sent abroad overseas to learn one of these languages in an immersive environment like an institute, and you would stay with a host family with a group of other Americans, things like that. The left side says no experience required. We have 14 languages. We don't require, I'm sorry, we have all of the languages on the left that don't require previous study. There are 3 there with an asterisk, and those will also show up over there on the other side where it says previous study required. And that's a little bit confusing, but let me explain. For those 3, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian, we would like for people to have studied, I think it's roughly about 2 semesters of language study in those languages to take advantage of the immersive environment and the travel aspect. But if you don't have those, 2 semesters of language study, we have what is called the Critical Language Spark program, the CL Spark program. That is, for those 3 languages, we can enroll you in a virtual language program for a year, and then you can avail yourself of the overseas immersive CL, the bigger Critical Language Scholarship program. So that's just a little caveat to this program, because I know the University of Arkansas probably offers many of these languages, but not all universities do. And we're trying to make this just as accessible as we can, sort of across America. The rest of those that are not denoted with an asterisk, those you can jump right into with 0 experience required. And if any of these scare you, and you speak Spanish, you might look at the Portuguese. That is the easiest one on that list, because it's a fairly easy transition from Spanish. So with that said, Dr. Hancock, let's move to the next slide. The next slide is the Gilman International Scholarship. This is also not only a language study scholarship, but also an internship. If you want to do an internship abroad, but you can't finance that, we have 2 types. Gilman Scholarship Program for those who are Pell Grant recipients, and that scholarship is up to $5,000, up to $8,000 for if you study one of those critical languages. There is really not very many constraints placed on the time that you spend abroad. What they really like to see is that you spend a longer amount of time. So if you have a full semester or even a full year that you would like to spend overseas doing these things, the Gilman is one of those programs that will help finance that. The Gilman McCain Scholarship is the same, except you must be a dependent child of an active duty military member. Dr. Hancock's next slide, please. And I would say, in addition to the Gilman, there is another that the Department of Defense supports, finances, and promotes, called the Boren Award. And we also mention it because it's an excellent program, the Boren Award. And that is also a very long-term, 6 months to a year's worth of study finance. And I think they pay up to about $25,000. So if anybody would like to get more information on that, I'm happy to provide that as well. This slide, it talks about our fellowships. We have a number of, we're transitioning from sort of undergrad to graduate school now. If there are folks on the call who will be graduating in the spring and are considering going to graduate school, there are 5 particular fellowships that we, as the State Department, provide that have an added benefit of not only paying for your graduate program, your 2-year program, but also giving you 2 internships during those summers in between your studies. And at the end, the most important part is we commission you as a Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Department of State. These 5 fellowships all do exactly the same thing. The career into which you're placed differs somewhat for each of those. Right now, the Wrangell and the Pickering programs are both open. They both lead to a career as a Foreign Service officer generalist. So one of those 5 career tracks: consular, economic, political, public diplomacy, or management. That's the Wrangell and the Pickering. Those are both open for applications right now through, I think, sort of the end of September. The Foreign Affairs IT Fellowship is exactly the same, but it will land you in a position as an IT specialist, information technology specialist. We call them diplomatic technology officers. So this is for folks who want to be a specialist, who really have specialized in computer science or cybersecurity or things like that. The Clark Diplomatic Security Fellowship similarly will conclude with you being assigned as a diplomatic security special agent. So one of our diplomatic corps, security corps. The Payne Fellowship, and we haven't talked very much about the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. That is sort of a hybrid part of the U.S. Department of State. They're connected to the Department of State, but they do international development work. So much of our foreign assistance from the U.S. government passes through USAID to do humanitarian assistance or development work. If that is of interest to you, then the Payne Fellowship leads to a career as a USAID Foreign Service officer. So we like to mention that during our presentation as well. Dr. Hancock's next slide, please. If, by all means, apply to all of these things, but I want to make it clear that the U.S. Department of State is not the only federal agency out there that hires interns for the summer and for the fall and spring semester as well. So this is a tool that that was just developed and rolled out about 18 months ago. It's the Go Government Federal Internship Finder. So all of the Department of State internships that you have heard about today will be there, as will all of the CIA or FBI or Department of Justice or, you name it, federal agency. They will post their internships there as well. And many of them, just like the Department of State, will be open, if not right now, over the next month or month and a half, because many of these will have the same types of security requirements that the Department of State has as well. So if please apply to the Department of State, definitely, but also look around and see if other parts of the U.S. government might not interest you. We love to hire Foreign Service officers that have done internships in other federal agencies because they understand other parts of the U.S. government. That's really key. When you deal with other parts of the U.S. government in U.S. embassies abroad, we have a wide representation of those folks abroad. Dr. Hancock, the next and last slide, please. This is just some quick QR codes. If you'd like to get in touch with me and our sort of network of recruiters, you can do so via LinkedIn or via our yellow, we call it our yellow database. It is being transitioned at this point and will be different in a month, but still accessible if you'd like to sign up to receive sort of real-time notifications about these programs and get on our distro list and receive newsletters and things like that. So let me leave it there. I know I have taken more than the promised 25 or 30 minutes and open it up to any comments or any questions that the group might have. Thank you for your attention. And Dr. Hancock, there's a question about accessing the slides. I am happy to send, I know you have recorded. I am also happy to send the slide deck to you all for distribution. Please distribute it broadly.
I can send it to the list of people who registered. The deck that you sent me, is that good to
Yes,
go? Yeah,
that's correct.
I
Thank
can
you.
do that.
And I am on my phone. I am not able to see a lot of the chat. Let
I
me,
can read them out to you if that's
oh, yes.
helpful. Let's see. Let me go. They're coming in fast and furious. Okay. What are post-grad options beside grad school programs?
So for the Department of State, you will find on USA Jobs a number of civil service opportunities. And that is for folks who would like to do things like be a foreign affairs officer in our headquarters in Washington. There's a lot of travel involved, but they are based in Washington. So they don't live overseas, but many of them do a lot of traveling back and forth overseas. That is a pretty straightforward application process through USA Jobs. You identify the job that looks interesting to you, and there's dozens of them. You apply just like any other job, and the application process continues that way. For the Foreign Service, once you've graduated, in fact, we don't require any type of graduate degree or even an undergraduate degree to apply to the Foreign Service. There is no requirement that you have anything more than a high school diploma to apply. That doesn't mean that a high school graduate with no work experience is going to be competitive. They will not be. But a high school graduate only that went off and did 30 years of interesting work experience and other things might be a compelling candidate. So as you graduate from your undergrad programs, think about how you can make yourself a better candidate by taking advantage of any type of international sort of opportunities. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I talk about the Peace Corps all the time because it's such an excellent program. That is a great ramp into the Foreign Service. It's not direct, but we hire a ton of returned Peace Corps volunteers. AmeriCorps is also one of those things. But you would access you'd apply to the Foreign Service once you're finished with school through our Foreign Service Officer testing process. It's called the FSOT. And that is a process, that's a test. It's a written test that we give 3 times a year. That were you to pass that test leads you to what we call the officer assessment. It's more of an oral interviewing process. And then once you're through that, there's a process to get your security clearance, and it can run up to about 9 months. But that is easy for anybody. You can sign up to register, take that test 3 times a year, and then you basically apply through that testing process.
I'm going to group some of these. We'll come
Okay.
back to a little bit more about some job opportunities, but regarding the opportunities that you talked about today, how competitive are they? How many people typically apply each year is the question.
Okay. So for the 2 internship programs, the USF SIP, which is the 2 summer program, is a small program. We typically will hire probably 50 or so interns nationwide. So quite competitive. But again, we don't get a lot of applications from the central south part of the country. So that is taken into account when applications are reviewed. So I wouldn't, I would suggest please don't talk yourself out of applying for that, because I think you stand a better chance than were you applying from Georgetown or Stanford or some of these these programs that really generate a lot of applications. For the student internship program, we hire 750 interns per year, and that's in 3 tranches: spring, summer, fall. So for the fall, we will hire roughly 250 interns. So the chances of getting an internship are quite good. And even better if you can apply for a spring internship or a fall internship. For some of our language programs, I think we probably award at least 300 critical language scholarships a year, if not more. And Boren Awards that I mentioned is administered by the Department of Defense. They do many more than that. I don't know how many, but they do hundreds of those. So, what I tend to tell students that are interested in any of this is apply to all of it if you have the time to get through the process. of applying. I know it's a crazy part of the academic year trying to start your classes and things like that. But if you can take time to apply to as many of these things as possible, it is definite that you won't get all of them. But if you get one of them, that's a win, and you will get 0 of them if you don't apply to them. So that's an important point to make.
And I do know that we've had several students get the Gilman, for example.
That's
Our
right.
students have been quite competitive for that. Okay, let's see. When should applicants expect to hear back from the State Department regarding the internships? So how
I'm
long?
sorry, Dr. Hancock.
How long does the process take? So if the applications close in early September, when would they expect to hear about the?
So I know that so for the US FSIP that's open now and will close in roughly 10 days from now. I know that the panels that review those can convene almost immediately after that. So you will probably, and I think that's very similar to the SIP internship as well. So you'll start to hear back from them probably within a month of applying. The catch for all of these programs is that you are given an interim offer that is contingent upon you getting a security clearance in the end. So we do have the occasional person that did just loads of travel overseas, and it really is going to take longer than the 4 months that we have to do a security clearance. And those people will often be advised that they're not going to get through that process, and so they'll have to they'll not be considered for the internship. That's not frequent. It's relatively rare, so I wouldn't let that stand in anybody's way of applying, but that happens every so often.
Do you have to be an American citizen to apply for these opportunities?
Yes, you do. You can be a naturalized U.S. citizen. We don't care what flavor of U.S. citizen you are. All U.S. citizens are the same for purposes of this of all these programs.
What about, are there any options for freshmen, or are upperclassmen always preferred? So they would be right, by the time they did it, they'd be rising sophomores.
So freshmen cannot apply to the internship programs that we have been talking about, but I am fairly certain that freshmen can apply to the Critical Language Scholarship Program and the SPARK program. So if they're interested in the language study abroad part, they can apply for that.
Are there any internships for engineers, specifically industrial engineers?
I'm glad someone asked that question. I'm a mechanical engineer and a recovering engineer, given that I'm a Foreign Service officer and don't do engineering at the moment. We have loads of opportunities for STEM field folks like engineers, because we have a whole section of the embassy that does all sorts of things like maintenance, facilities management, building and construction, architecture. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have about 275 large buildings and facilities all overseas. And so, for instance, we have what we call the Bureau of Overseas Building Operations. That's where most of our engineers will go. But we also hire engineers in our Bureau of Cybersecurity, for instance, or if we have computer engineers, for instance, they would go to places like cybersecurity and things like that. But we're also looking for maybe not exactly the engineering. We're not looking for the calculus skills of most engineers. We're looking for the problem solving skills. And those folks can really build a great, not only internship, but career using those skills in lots of places like, arms control and sanctions. Or I started off in refugee affairs because I really liked humanitarian assistance, and I liked the logistical part of getting, food aid from point A to point B. So there's a lot of these opportunities where you might not use your differential equations course, but you're going to use a lot of your problem solving skills.
If we've traveled overseas a lot, would it reduce our chances of accessing these opportunities?
No, it should not. The occasional problem that we see are when people will travel say we have dual national folks who are Chinese and travel back to mainland China, for instance, or travel to Cuba or travel to Nicaragua, or some of the places that we really don't have a lot of access to do our investigations because the government's not friendly to us necessarily. So in those rare instances, international travel might extend the security clearance process beyond the time that we can still accept them as candidates. But in general, it does not. And in fact, international travel should enhance your candidacy rather than hurt it.
We have a student that would like to hear a little bit more about the diplomatic security officer position that you were talking about.
So those folks do our investigations, primarily visa fraud investigations overseas. They run all of our residential security programs. They're in charge of both the physical and the information security of our embassies abroad. So they'll get involved in cybersecurity investigations with other parts of the U.S. government. They're really the folks that keep us safe overseas. So they're sort of like most people know what an FBI agent does. A DS special agent will do similar things with a lot more focus on physical security of personnel. They are also in charge of things like the Marine Security Detachment that every embassy has. Most people, if you said, what is the most important thing to protect overseas, they would say it's American diplomats overseas that should be protected. And that is important. But one of the most important things to protect is the information that we have in our embassies. We have all sorts of classified, unclassified, sure, but unclassified, sensitive, but unclassified, secret, classified, and highly classified. So all of that is just as important as sort of our American diplomats overseas as far as protection comes. So that DS special agent is doing a whole lot of cybersecurity and making sure our information systems are protected as well.
This might be getting a little much in the weeds, but we have a student that wanted you to speak some more about the Foreign Officer Service Assessment.
So we have the two parts of the entry process for foreign service officers. The FSOT, which is the Foreign Service Officer Test, that's the written test. And then it sounds like they're asking about the second part, which is the Foreign Service Officer Assessment. That is sort of an oral-based assessment, and both of these are done virtually now. So you would do them from a Zoom window, along with 6 or 7 other candidates. That consists of things like a case management exercise where you're given a memo to read. And then you have to come to a decision and then brief the ambassador orally, a person, one of our examiners who will be posing as an ambassador, and they'll judge you on how you do that. Other things like a group exercise is you would represent a country, almost like in a model UN situation where you would represent Uruguay, and you need to argue several points and give and take with other members of your group. And then there's going to be a structured interview as well, where we're just going to ask you questions about your past and about what your motivations are for joining, your commitment to public service, and things like that.
Somebody asked for the email, so I just put the slide back up. Does previous participation in State Department programs help benefit applications for future programs?
In most cases, yes, they do. We tend to look for people who are interested in international affairs, and those are people that are often applying and getting other programs previously. So we tend to try to bring in new people so that sort of the benefits of the programs are sort of spread around in a more even way. But oftentimes we'll have sort of repeat candidates that will do a student internship summer, but then they'll also take advantage of the critical language scholarship. It is unlikely that you would get say back-to-back internships. Once you do an internship, generally you would not apply for another. But you could take advantage of some of the other language programs or other things that I've talked about today in addition to that internship.
And I think this will be the last question. And I'll also on this is a question about a student would like you to expand on the Boren Awards. And I believe Emily, right? You're here. This is an area that you can help students prepare for application to these awards as well. So Shane, if you want to expand on the Boren Award, and there's Emily, if the student is interested in applying, she can assist with that.
Thank you, Dr. Hancock. It's a good question. The Boren, we're not specialists in the Boren Award, but we do mention it because it is it's something that makes our candidates really desirable in many ways. We're looking for folks to come into the Foreign Service who may not speak, a number of languages, but have demonstrated that they can learn languages, because that's an integral part of a successful career in the Foreign Service. So the Boren is again administered by the Department of Defense. It is not a State Department program, but it is meant to be a longer, in my understanding, a longer term program. So up to a year, but the Boren Award will sort of subsidize your study overseas, or doing internships and things like that. So they tend, as I understand it, they tend to prefer 6 month to a year types of scholarships, and don't tend to choose candidates that are only interested in 8 weeks, unless it is in something very specific, like a critical language, and maybe you already have some experience in that language, things like that. But let me stop there before I exceed my understanding of this program.
Yeah, so I think if you're interested in, and Emily, you can stop me, in the Boren, the fellowships like the Pickering, the critical language scholarships, you should reach out to Emily Wright, and we'll follow up with an email on how to do that, but perhaps you might put your email in the chat, Emily, so they have that. If you're interested in the Gilman, maybe a good start here is to talk to Katie Sabo. And if you're interested in the internships, there are all kinds of career resources that can help you with some of the application materials, and we'll follow up with those, the details on those. All right. Well, I think if we don't have any other questions, we'll leave it there. Shane, thank you so much. I think this has been a great information session and great opportunities for children. They're not children, students in this field. It's getting late in the day. So we thank you for that. And students, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Hancock. Thank you to Dr. Hammond as well, and other faculty members on the call.
Yeah, for international studies.
It's always great to touch both the international, the students, interested in international affairs, and also the honor students, because honor students already, have a trajectory in mind, and that's the kind of student we're looking for. So thank you all for this opportunity.